We're gonna have foods and snacks and trivia and prizes. Later in the year, I know we are doing a historical cooking day where we're gonna get together and cook historical recipes from way in the past, which I'm looking forward to with the faculty. And basically, the UMHISA is a great way to meet a lot of people. UMHISA is why I ended up doing a history major, because I had friends related to the department, and it really helped me. It helped enhance my university experience, especially during COVID. So if there's any questions? Yes?
I have a friend from this class who might be interested. Can you just show up, or do you have to be on the email list to go?
We have tickets that are free. You can be on the email list, which will help you keep up to date. If they're not in this class, just go to umhisa.ca, our website where you can sign up. We have this sign-in sheet where we just add people manually, but there's also, you could just, if you don't know, you don't have to sign up, you could just get the email or go on the website, enter in your email, and you'll be added to the list automatically. All right, I'm going to pass around this list. Thank you for your time.
So, should I bring the sign-up sheet or what?
I'll just wait at the back, and they can just pass me through, and then I'll leave. It was good seeing you, Heller.
Okay, just
I'll talk to you closer to the first assignment.
yes.
Right.
Okay. So, yesterday I put on Learn. I put some maps up, and I also put up under the category keywords all the words, the unfamiliar words that I might use in this lecture. So you just go to Learn content, and the maps and those unfamiliar words will show up. So now let's get into the lecture, and I'll pick up where I left off last time and then plunge forward. I could begin by, of course, noting that in 1500 there was a basic equilibrium between the major civilizations, the major areas of the world. There was still limited contact, but you had in Eurasia, you had India, you had China, you had the Middle East, you had Russia, you had Western Europe, and you could say that there was a kind of rough equilibrium, economic and political, between these different areas, emphasizing limited contact. But as time passed, from the beginning of the 16th century to the end of the 18th century, you see a change. You see the emergence and rise of Western Europe, and because of the development of capitalism and because of the political power of the major European states and their growing military prowess, they gradually intrude themselves more and more and overcome the resistance of begin to overcome the resistance of the other parts of the world. In particular, one would emphasize in terms of actually penetrating these other societies, the fact that the Europeans have developed very sophisticated naval ships and military technology is very important in explaining their growing superiority. Now, in terms of this process, how it unfolded, in the first place, in the 16th century, as you probably know, following the arrival of Columbus in the New World, the Spanish invaded Central and South America, and the Portuguese had likewise simultaneously landed in Brazil. And in the course of the 16th century, these conquerors had actually invaded the landmass of Latin America and established political control over Latin America by the end of the 16th century. Now, in time past, but with this sort of development of West European power, we can say by the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire, which was this huge empire which dominated the Middle East and North Africa, this enormous empire, larger than any European state, nevertheless, the British and the French in particular had basically subordinated the Ottoman Empire. They had economically penetrated and politically intimidated the Ottoman Sultan and the Ottoman authorities, and the Ottomans were really now more and more manipulated by these two great European powers, the British, the English, and the French. Likewise, in India, we see the British and the French active, but it's the British who gain the advantage. And already by the middle of the 18th century, the British are in the course of actually conquering India. India, which had been ruled by a great Muslim empire, the Mughals, by the middle of the 18th century, the English were taking over. So Latin America in the 16th century, and then in the 18th century, the Mughal Empire and the Ottoman Empire are subordinated to the West Europeans. Even China, which is in 1500 is clearly the biggest and most powerful state in the world, politically, the size of China, which is and has long since been a unified state, with a sort of powerful bureaucracy and a substantial army, and nevertheless, you can see by the end of the 18th century, under the influence of European penetration, but also because of internal decay, the Europeans are beginning to gain the advantage in China. And then if we look at Africa, which West Europe, particularly the Portuguese, began to deal with in the course of the 15th century already, and this is very important, Portugal, a little country, nevertheless, it begins to open up active activities with Africa, particularly West Africa. Well, West Africa in general was a continent in which most people were peasants, and there were what I would call African kingdoms, some of them quite large. And even if you take the case of the Congo, for example, or Mali, there were substantial towns in Africa. There were, or we could look at Ethiopia or the Sudan. There were veritable civilizations in Africa. And more generally, you have peasant agriculture, but you have tribal chieftains who are really kings that resemble the European kings, you could say. And basically, they and an African nobility, they basically collected a kind of rent, if you like, from the peasants. Very similar to what was the case in Europe. I think the only anomaly was that whereas in Europe, slavery had disappeared at the end of the Middle Ages, in Africa, slavery was an important institution, and I'll have more to say about that a little bit later. So this is the situation in 1500. But in the course of time, particularly because of the development of the European slave trade, starting in the 15th century already, the development of the European slave trade, which involved violence, In the course of the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, Africa suffered a great deterioration. Some 20 million Africans were exported as slaves to the New World to work in the sugar plantations and the other plantations owned by Europeans. And meanwhile, the trade in slaves, the demand for slaves, set up a series of wars, and slavery became the dominant sort of driving force of great wars that ravaged Africa, violence in the course of these centuries, and it depopulated Africa. Africa lost millions of people during this period. And the states that I've talked about, especially the ones in West Africa, turned into slave kingdoms. It was all about seizing slaves and selling them to the white slavers. And so by 1800, Africa was in a terrible situation, and the Europeans, although they couldn't penetrate inland, they didn't have the capacity to do that. Nevertheless, it was this contact with the Europeans that was undermining Africa. So what we can say that while Europe was developing, Africa was undeveloping. There was a recession of Africa. So that is the situation. And we can say that although our course breaks off at the end of the 18th century with the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution, the next century, that is to say the 19th century, the Europeans had developed such power that they began to politically colonize the rest of the world. The 19th century is the great age of European colonization, and Europeans basically installed governments, colonial governments, in most of the global south. Especially notable, of course, is the British Empire and the French Empire. The French and the British were the leading colonial powers, but there were others as well, Belgians, the Dutch, and so on. And of course, to simply reiterate, it is capitalism that underneath is driving this, but it reflects itself in the strong European states with their armies and navies, sophisticated bureaucratic control, and military prowess, who are enabled through this process. Now, of course, so capitalism plays this huge role, and of course, what we must understand that the rise of capitalism that I'm talking about is synonymous with the greater and greater power we'll call the capitalist class, the middle class, the merchants and the manufacturers, who during the feudal period had a very peripheral role in European society. They become more and more powerful in the course of the 16th and 17th century. So it's the rise of capitalism, but it's also the rise of this middle class. We say middle because they were not landed feudal nobility and they were not peasants. They were in the middle. Sometimes these people are called the bourgeoisie. And their emergence, of course, is based on trade and developing manufacturing or more sophisticated methods of farming, but it is also due to the fact that this class ultimately resorts to violence to achieve its objectives, because capitalism is directly related to the European revolutions. European history is marked by a series of revolutions. And what these revolutions are all about is essentially the breakthrough of the rising middle class to take over political power. And the first of these occurred in the 16th century in Holland. In 1576, there was a revolution in Holland, and the merchant and manufacturing class in Holland seized power from the monarchy and the nobility. They became the ruling class in Holland. Holland is thoroughly bourgeois, middle class republic by the end of the 16th century. And that revolution was followed by the English Revolution. In 1642, revolution broke out in England. And the monarchy, after a civil war broke out, the monarchy lost power, and England became, for basically 2 decades, a republic. The English don't like, the English upper class don't like to mention this, but the fact is that England, in the middle of the 17th century, became a republic. Does anybody know the name of the leader of that republic? What's his name?
Oliver Cromwell.
Oliver Cromwell. Well, the English don't know what to make of this guy. It's true that a statue is erected to him in honor of him before the Houses of Parliament, but because, of course, England ultimately returned to a monarchical form of government, they would like to forget all of this. But it happened, and what happened basically was the power, the political power, went from the monarchy and the nobility into the hands of the middle class. Parliament ruled. Parliament was the ultimate sovereign after this revolution in the middle of the 17th century. And basically you see the same thing happening in France. 1789, French Revolution. It's the middle class that comes to power. Same process. And just as in England, as a matter of fact, since this is happening this week, we have Charles III, of course, now as the English king, and I guess he's our king as well. But people mention the fact that his namesake, Charles I, actually had his head cut off by the English revolutionaries. And likewise in France, the king of that time, Louis XVI, and his consort, who was the wife of Louis XVI? Yes. Marie Antoinette, this famous story of Marie Antoinette. Yes, in the course of seizing power, they did away with their king. Now, I just want to sort of continue this and sort of ask the question, why I'm saying that capitalism sees the ascension of the middle class, and accompanying this at critical moments, when the middle class becomes powerful enough, they attempt to take over the state by revolution. And they do it in these 3 important countries, the vanguard countries of capitalism. They basically establish middle class rule, which involves the key thing is the establishment of constitutional government. The establishment of constitutional government. Well, why did this happen? Well, ultimately, one must then understand that in history and now, in the contemporary world, everything happens at the political level. The state is the crucial level at which political and social struggle occurs. It occurs at the state. It occurs in the political realm. And that's why politics are so important. Why day to day you turn on the news, it's all about politics, because that's the principal arena in which underneath the social and economic dynamics of society are playing themselves out at the level of politics. And these revolutions happened because prior to those revolutions, it was the king and the nobility and the traditional church, or the medieval church, we can say, that controlled politics. So they organize society. The state has the capacity to organize and reorganize society. I don't have to explain to you today how important the state's role in our lives is enormous. Well, it was true back then as well. Well, controlling the state becomes really important. And the middle class in each of these revolutions felt that the kings, the nobles, and the established churches did not understand the needs and the problems of the middle class. The middle class wanted things like a unified market. They wanted free trade. They wanted state protection for overseas economic ventures, colonial ventures. And this was not, the state was interfering with the economic life of the country, and the middle class resented it. So it basically, through revolution, the state fell into the hands of the middle class. Oh, I should also mention the level of taxes. That's critically important. Because now when the middle class controls the state, they can set the level of taxation. Well, so that's the main reason why these revolutions had it, why they took place. Now, usually, well, in these three cases, the onset of the revolution was some sort of economic crisis. An economic crisis was the occasion. So these were the great revolutions of the past, the great European revolutions of the past. But I would ask the question, is revolution simply in the past, or does it happen in the present as well? What's your opinion? What do you know? Has revolution happened in the recent past? Well, I could point out that in Latin America, we had revolution in Nicaragua, we had revolution in Venezuela, and we had revolution in Bolivia in the last decade. These were socialist revolutions. But we've also had, for example, in 1980, there was a revolution by the working class against the bureaucratic communist regime in Poland. And it was overthrown, and eventually capitalism was reinstalled in Poland. And we could say, although it's very debatable, the same thing happened in Russia in 1989. So yes, there were capitalist revolutions in the early modern period. We've seen socialist revolutions in the recent period, but we've seen also capitalist revolutions in these two instances. Russia, as a matter of fact, is a capitalist state. It was once, of course, the chief state of socialism. Now, carrying this a bit further, the question is revolution possible? I would say it is possible. In many places in the world, social inequality, economic crisis, poor government provides the basis for further revolution. So revolution is an ongoing phenomenon in the modern world, but the first of these revolutions happened back in the early modern period. And certainly in terms of the early modern period, in terms of its overall importance, the French Revolution is the most important. The two great revolutions that have happened in history are the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, because they changed everything. Okay. So, having said that, now I want to turn to, now we're going to begin to look at, more particularly at the world as it was in 1500. We're going to start with 1500. Well, I want to say a few things about that. First of all, we're dealing with, I just want to recall to you, we're going, in terms of the narrative in these lectures, we're going to be dealing, of course, with Western Europe, but we're going to go into some detail about how these states and empires in Latin America, prior to the intrusion of the Europeans with Columbus, that is to say, the Aztec Empire and the Inca Empire, what they were all about. We're going to, as much as we can, sort of try to understand these empires on their own terms. And then we're going to be looking at the Ottoman Empire that dominated the Middle East. Then we're going to go on and look at India under the Mughals. Then we're going to look at China. And finally, we're going to look at these African kingdoms and the dynamics by which they worked as well. Those are the successive steps. And then we'll kind of sum up the coming of the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. That's the trajectory. Now, I've made a big thing of capitalism, the strong European states, their military and political power, and so on. But I would say, in terms of sort of concluding this brief overview, why did the Europeans overcome these other states, these other empires? Well, it was partly the Europeans were too strong. The shock of capitalism was so great on these societies that they caved. They couldn't resist this new, more powerful economic form. However, we also should note that in some ways these empires were fragile. They had little power to resist. And the reason for that was that if you begin to look at all of them, there is, over time, there is a problem of economic exploitation. In every one of these cases, you'll see that the level of exploitation, that is to say, the taxes, the rents collected from ordinary people, became so great that there was a progressive alienation between the rulers and those who were ruled, common people, the peasants, were alienated from their governments. If perhaps there had been a closer relationship between the rulers and the ruled, they might have been able to put up a better resistance against the Europeans than they were able to. The second weakness that these states, these empires had faced with the Europeans is they, of course, were dominated by traditionalist ideology. Whereas the Europeans were moving in the centuries that we're talking to towards reason and science, challenging custom, tradition, and religion, most of these states, China, of course, being a little bit exceptional, most of these states were dominated precisely by custom, tradition, religion, and faced with science and European rationalism, their understanding of what was happening was relatively limited. And the last reason, in addition to what we call overexploitation and being dominated by tradition rather than reason, the third reason why they fell was that their elites, the rulers themselves, were divided. There were political divisions or ethnic divisions within each of these societies. Within China, within India, within the Ottoman Empire, et cetera, which the ruling classes were divided, fighting amongst themselves. And so they did not unify in the face of the Europeans. So this concludes the overview. Before I actually get, and what we're approaching now, is the whole question of what is a civilization, what are the characteristics of a civilization, and sort of, because all of the states that I'm considering were, in effect, what we can call civilizations, I want to deal with a sort of a general analytical framework for sort of understanding this. And of course, the first review question is about civilization. So it's important now to pay attention because this begins the answer to the first review question. So in the first place, there is capitalism, the new economic system which comes into being after 1500. But you should understand that capitalism is the last of a series of previous what are called modes of production. That is to say, the earliest mode of production in human history was what we call the hunting and gathering mode. The hunting and gathering. We're talking about people who basically lived off the land, hunting animals, fishing, and gathering, foraging in the forests, in the meadows for food. There's huge amounts of food available in that sense. So these are the hunters and gatherers. This is the earliest form of human society prior to civilization itself. And of course, it's still with us because, for example, in Canada, vast areas of Canada are still inhabited by hunting and gathering people who make, even now, a substantial part of their livelihood by hunting and gathering. Of course, capitalism is penetrated, but it's estimated that 1/4 of the Earth's surface is still exploited by hunting and gathering society. Following that, in a sequence, we can speak about, after hunting and gathering society, we can talk about slavery as a economic system. And we know that, for example, that in ancient Greece and Rome, the basic labor force, the key labor force, there were peasants, the key labor force in these societies were slaves. So we speak about a slave mode of production. Hunting and gathering, number one, slavery, number two, and thirdly, and very important, is what we call feudalism, the feudal mode of production, or as it is now increasingly referred to, the tributary mode of production. Most of the people are peasants, but above the peasants are the landlords, and in order for the peasants to be able to work the land, they have to pay over a part of what they produce, either to the landlords or to the state as tax. So that's the third mode of production. Hunting and gathering, slavery, Greece and Rome, then the tributary or feudal mode of production, which was common to most of these civilizations that we're talking about. Finally, we get to capitalism. So the framework, the essential framework, hunting and gathering, slavery, feudalism, and finally capitalism. And Europe prior to 1500 is basically within the feudal mode of production. After 1500, capitalism is creeping in. Capitalism is creeping in. Feudalism is based on the collection of rent or taxes given to the overlords, including the king. Capitalism is based on trade, but above all on profit taking. Okay? So let me sort of elaborate a little bit because it's a bit of a problem. This gives you the basic framework. And I've spoken about capitalism. First of all, briefly, what is capitalism? This is what I want to what is capitalism? Well, I would say that capitalism is basically, there are four components to capitalism. First of all, the first component are the workers. People who work for wages. People who sell their labor in return for wages are workers. And the second, so the workers are the first element, who are selling their labor because they don't have other means of production. Workers generally do not have land or do not have access to land. So the only thing that they have to sell is their labor power. So that's the first thing. The second thing is there are people willing to buy their labor. These people are known as capitalists, the buyers of labor power. And what do the capitalists do with this labor power? They manufacture, they make commodities, things for sale in the marketplace. Commodities, something for sale in the marketplace. So the second element of capitalism is the purchase of labor power by capitalists in order to manufacture commodities. The third element of capitalism is the sale of those commodities in the marketplace. That's the third element of capitalism. And the fourth and last element of capitalism is the realization of that sale of commodities in the form of money profit. I emphasize money profit. Money. The capitalists realize a profit by selling commodities in the market. To reiterate, workers sell their labor power. That labor power is bought by capitalists who use the labor power to make commodities. They then sell it in the marketplace, and they realize a profit in the form of money. Money is important because these capitalists use part of that money in order to enjoy themselves, take vacations in wintertime, and so on. But much more important, much more crucial, is that they reinvest part of that profit in expanding their businesses by employing more workers, by buying new machines. They can expand their business. And the net result of this, if you realize it, is a big cycle of offer of labor, purchase of labor, production of commodities, profit. Profit is used mainly to reinvest in the business, to expand the business, and this becomes a cycle, a repeated cycle, which we call the accumulation of capital. This is the accumulation of capital. This is the way capital develops, by repeated cycle after cycle of this kind of capitalist expansion. So that, roughly speaking, is a definition of capital, but you'll find a more close definition in my book. Now that's capital, and it underlies what is happening in Europe. The accumulation of capital from one century to the next. Ultimately, the development, this is the powerhouse, the engine, which is powering Western European and Western society and allowing it to become as powerful as it does. However, there is a methodological problem with what I've told you. We cannot simply reduce politics and culture and religion and ideology to this economic system. This is called reductionism. You can't explain political change directly, why one government falls and another doesn't. We can't understand why people in Western Canada have one way of looking at the world and people in the East have another way of looking at the world. We can't understand the differences between Catholics and Protestants by invoking capitalism directly. We have to develop a finer mode of analysis. And we do this by using, let me be blank, anthropology to help us. Because anthropology, one of the key concepts of anthropology is something called culture. The anthropologists were the first ones to develop this, but it has become very important to all of the social science disciplines. And basically, this anthropological approach, culture, it does include the economic. It does include social relationships. But culture includes those things, but it also includes tradition, custom, science, philosophy. It's a sort of comprehensive view of things. And it does allow to say, yes, the economy is important, but politics are important, religion is important. And to see all of these things as part of a unity, that's the key thing here. That culture takes a unified view of society. And we need that in order to refine our analysis. We can't just use economic terms like capitalism in order to understand history. So culture is an important aspect of our approach to analysis. Now, having said all of this now, I would say I would now move to the point that I would say that when we get to what we can call the slave or the feudal mode of production, we see that civilizations are born. Civilizations are born as part of the slave and the feudal mode of production. Now we're beginning to talk seriously about civilization. Civilization. Well, in the first place, this happens way back in history, and I'm going to talk about that. But I want, first of all, to describe to you in just in descriptive terms what do scholars consider to be the essential aspects of a civilization. Western Europe is a civilization, China is a civilization, Mogul India is a civilization. What is civilization is the question I'm asking, and you will have to answer on your review question. Well, in the first place, the term, where does the term come from? Civilization. It comes from city. The term city. The Latin term for city is civitas. Civitas. So out of civitas, we get civilization. So the first characteristic of a civilization is that some part of the population is beginning to live in cities. That's category number one. Now, this population living in cities, well, how do they feed themselves? In order people live in cities really can't grow their own food. Life in the city, whether you're a craftsman or you're a government official, is only possible because there are peasants out in the countryside or farmers out in the country who are growing your food. So the second indispensable element to civilization, the first is living in cities, urbanization, the emergence of cities. The second is agriculture, the invention of agriculture with its surpluses. Peasants begin to produce more food than they need for their families. And the result is that these agricultural surpluses make possible urban life. And the third characteristic, and I'm going to stop with this, is on top of the urban population, there comes into being a state and a ruling class. That's the third basic element of life and civilization. And we'll continue this in the next class. What's that?
I didn't get the sheet for last one. No, for the last two. I should tell them.
Send me an email, please.
Of course, no problem. So, they get a receipt.
What's that?
They get a receipt.
Could you sign today?
Yeah, I did sign today.
Okay.
And I really approved it.
No. Just send me an email.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
What's that? Yes, yes.
I have one class at 1 to 2 after.